A lonely rancher bought an Apache girl for $5, unaware she'd carry his legacy. The Montana winter of 1872 was particularly brutal, leaving the small town of Whiteridge blanketed in 3 feet of snow. For James Cooper, a 38-year-old rancher with weathered skin and calloused hands, the isolation felt heavier than usual. His 200-acre cattle ranch, nestled against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, had been his life's work since he'd come west after the Civil War ended. The war had left him with a slight limp and memories he preferred to keep buried. That February morning, James hitched his horses to the sled and made the arduous journey into town for supplies. Whiteridge consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of wooden buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support against the bitter wind. "Mornin', Cooper," drawled Sam Winters, the store owner. "Thought you might have frozen solid out at that ranch of yours." James nodded curtly. "Takes more than cold to keep me from my cattle." While gathering his supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, and a new pair of gloves, James noticed a commotion outside. A small crowd had gathered around 2 men with a young Native American girl between them. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, with long black hair and eyes that darted around like a cornered animal. Her thin dress was wholly inadequate for the biting cold, and her small frame shivered violently. "What's happening out there?" James asked Sam. Sam spat tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Those traders found that Apache girl wandering half dead about 20 miles south. Say her whole family got wiped out in some skirmish. They're trying to sell her off as a servant before heading back to Arizona territory." James frowned. "And sell her? $5 is what they're asking. No takers yet. Most folks around here don't want Indian trouble." James finished his business and stepped outside, watching the spectacle with growing discomfort. The girl's captors were growing impatient. "Last chance," shouted the taller of the 2 men. $5 for a good worker. Otherwise, we're leaving her to fend for herself, and that's a death sentence in this weather." The girl's eyes met James's briefly. There was no pleading in them, only a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in one so young. Something about that look struck him, reminded him of the eyes he'd seen during the war, of people who'd lost everything but refused to surrender their spirit. Before he could think better of it, James found himself stepping forward. "I'll take her." A murmur ran through the small crowd. The trader grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Well now, looks like Cooper's gone soft, or maybe he's just lonely out there on that ranch of his." James ignored the insinuation and handed over $5 silver. "What's her name?" The trader shrugged. "Hell if I know. They call her something in Apache gibberish." The girl spoke for the first time, her voice barely audible but clear. "Nitika." "My name is Nitika." James nodded, then removed his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders. "Come on then, Nitika. Let's get you home." The ride back to the ranch was silent. James occasionally glanced at the small figure huddled beneath his coat, wondering what madness had possessed him. He had no use for a child, especially not an Apache girl who would likely run away at the first opportunity. Yet something about leaving her to die didn't sit right with him. When they arrived at his modest 2-story farmhouse, he showed her inside. The house was Spartan but clean, with a large fireplace in the main room that kept the worst of the cold at bay. "You can sleep there," he said, pointing to a small bedroom off the kitchen. "There's food in the pantry. I expect you to earn your keep, cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing." Nitika studied him with those unsettlingly perceptive eyes, then nodded once. "I don't hold with beating," James added awkwardly. "You work hard. We'll get along fine. You try to run, you'll freeze to death before you get 5 miles. That night, as James sat by the fire cleaning his rifle, he heard soft footsteps. Nitika appeared in the doorway, still wrapped in his coat despite the warmth of the house. "Why did you buy me?" she asked, her English surprisingly good. James considered the question. "It wasn't right, leaving a child to die." "I'm not a child. In my tribe, I would be preparing for marriage soon," James snorted. "Here." You're a child. Nitika stepped further into the room. My people are dead, all of them. The bluecoats came while the men were hunting. They killed everyone, even the babies. James felt a familiar weight in his chest, the same one he'd carried since Antietam, where he'd seen things no man should see. I was a blue coat once, he admitted. Saw too much killing. Came out here to get away from it. Nitika's expression didn't change. Then we both have ghosts. Little did James Cooper know that this $5 purchase would change not only his life, but the entire legacy of his bloodline. The lonely rancher and the displaced Apache girl stood at the beginning of a story that would span generations and redefine what it meant to build a family from the ashes of loss. Wait, don't leave yet. If you're captivated by James and Nitika's story, make sure you subscribe to our channel right now to see how this unlikely pair's journey unfolds. Will James find redemption through this unexpected responsibility? Will Nitika ever accept her new life? The answers might surprise you. Hit that subscribe button and join thousands of viewers who can't wait to see what happens next in this incredible true story from America's frontier past. Spring came late to Montana that year. By April, patches of stubborn snow still clung to the shadowed places on James Cooper's ranch, though green was beginning to reclaim the valley. For James and Nitika, the passing months had established an uneasy routine. The girl proved herself useful beyond James's expectations. She was up before dawn each day, rekindling the fire and preparing a simple breakfast before tackling the endless chores of ranch life. Her small hands grew calloused from work, but she never complained. What surprised James most was her affinity for the animals. The horses, normally skittish around strangers, accepted her immediately. Even his most temperamental mare, a chestnut named Sadie that had thrown 3 ranch hands, stood quietly while Nitika groomed her. "How do you do that?" James asked one morning, watching from the barn doorway as Nitika whispered something in Apache to the horse. Nitika glanced up. "I listened to them. Most people only talk." It was the kind of answer James had come to expect from her. Simple, yet somehow profound. The girl spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried weight. Despite her usefulness, James maintained his distance. He'd never been one for conversation, and having a child in the house, especially one who represented a world so different from his own, left him at a loss. Some evenings they would sit in the main room, James reading one of his few books while Nitika mended clothing by the fire, and not a word would pass between them. Their fragile equilibrium was shattered in late April when 3 men rode onto the property. James was mending a fence in the north pasture when he spotted them approaching the house. He hurried back, his old war instincts prickling with warning. He found Nitika on the porch, standing rigid as the men dismounted. They were a rough-looking trio, with the hard eyes of men who'd done things they didn't speak of in polite company. "Afternoon," the leader called, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. "Name's Holt. These are my brothers, Emmett and Levi. We're looking for work." James stepped up beside Nitika. "Don't need help." Holt's eyes lingered on Nitika. "Heard in town you had yourself an Indian girl. Didn't believe it till now." "What I have isn't your concern," James replied, his hand resting casually near the revolver on his hip. The man called Emmett spat on the ground. "Ain't right. White man living alone with a savage. People talk." "Then they're wasting breath," James said. "State your real business or ride on." Holt's friendly demeanor slipped, revealing something uglier beneath. "Maybe we don't like the idea of good Christian land being defiled by having an Apache on it. Maybe we're thinking of doing something about that." James drew his revolver in one fluid motion, pointing it steadily at Holt's chest. "Maybe you should reconsider." A tense silence followed, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses. James felt Nitika trembling slightly beside him, though her face remained impassive. Finally, Holt gave a cold laugh. "No need for that, Cooper. We're just making conversation." He remounted his horse. "But this territory's changing, civilizing. Might want to think about which side you're on." After they rode away, James remained on the porch until they were specks on the horizon. When he turned, he found Nitika watching him with an unreadable expression. "They will come back," she said simply. James nodded, probably. That night, he cleaned all his weapons and left them loaded. As he was checking the doors before turning in, he found Nitika sitting at the kitchen table, methodically sharpening a kitchen knife. "You should sleep," he told her. Nitika tested the blade's edge with her thumb. "My father was a warrior. Before the blue coats came, he taught me how to use a knife." James considered taking it from her, then thought better of it. "Just don't stab me if I get up for water in the night." For the first time since she'd arrived, Nitika smiled. A small, fleeting thing, but genuine. "I will try not to." The Holt brothers didn't return, but their visit changed something between James and Nitika. A shared threat had created a fragile alliance. Gradually, James began teaching Nitika more about the ranch, not just chores, but the business of it. How to judge a good calf for breeding, how to rotate grazing to keep the grass healthy, how to predict weather from the behavior of animals and the shape of clouds. In turn, Nitika began sharing small pieces of her culture. One evening, she prepared a traditional Apache meal with ingredients she'd gathered from the surrounding wilderness. Another day, she showed James how to make a poultice from local plants when one of his horses developed an infected cut. By early summer, the mission school in Helena had become a distant thought. Instead, James found himself making plans that included Nitika, expanding the vegetable garden she'd started, teaching her to read from his small collection of books, even considering buying a second horse so she could accompany him on longer rides around the property. One warm June evening, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Nitika broke their comfortable silence. "Why did you really buy me that day?" James took his time answering, rolling a cigarette with deliberate care. "When I saw you standing there in the snow, you reminded me of someone." "Who?" "My daughter. Emily was her name." James struck a match, the flare briefly illuminating his weathered face. "She and my wife died of fever in '65, right after I came home from the war. Emily was about your age." Nitika absorbed this information quietly. "Is that why you live alone? Because they died?" "Partly. Partly because the war showed me things about people I didn't want to see, made it hard to be around them afterward. But you are around me," Nitika pointed out. James exhaled a stream of smoke. "You're different because I am Apache. Because you don't expect me to be anything other than what I am." Nitika considered this. "In my tribe, after great loss, it is believed that a person must find their way back to harmony. Some never do. They become like ghosts, walking among the living but not truly there." She looked at him directly. "I think you were becoming a ghost." James Cooper. He couldn't argue with her assessment. Before she'd arrived, his days had blurred together in a haze of work and solitude, each indistinguishable from the last. He'd been existing, not living. "And now?" he asked. Nitika shrugged. "Now you argue with me about whether the garden needs more water. Ghosts do not care about gardens." James laughed, a rusty sound from disuse. "No, I suppose they don't." By the fall of 1873, the ranch had undergone a subtle transformation. New curtains hung in windows that had been bare for years. The garden behind the house had expanded to include not only vegetables, but also medicinal herbs that Nitika cultivated with careful attention. Inside, James's once Spartan home now held small touches of comfort. Woven blankets, polished stones arranged on the mantel, wildflowers in jars during summer months. James himself had changed too. The perpetual furrow between his brows had softened. He spoke more, laughed occasionally, and had even begun joining other ranchers at the general store on Saturday afternoons, exchanging news and advice rather than hurrying through his business and leaving town as quickly as possible. The most significant change, however, came in September, when James returned from town with paperwork that he placed on the kitchen table while Nitika prepared supper. "What are these?" she asked, eyeing the official-looking documents. James cleared his throat. "I spoke with Judge Wilson today about your situation." Nitika's hands stilled on the knife she was using to chop carrots. In the 18 months since she'd arrived, they had never formally discussed her status. She worked the ranch alongside James, and in return he provided food, shelter, and increasingly knowledge, teaching her to read English, to handle the ranch's accounts, to shoot with reasonable accuracy. "And what did the judge say?" she asked carefully. James ran a hand through his hair, now more grey than brown. "He says that legally things are complicated. You're Apache, which means, according to the government, you don't have the same rights as—" he trailed off. "As white people," Nitika finished flatly. "Yes, but you're also a minor with no guardian. The judge suggested—" James paused, then continued with uncharacteristic hesitation. "He suggested I could file for legal guardianship, make it official." Nitika's dark eyes studied him. "What would that mean?" "It would mean that legally I'd be responsible for you until you come of age. You'd have my name, Cooper. Nitika Cooper," she said, testing the sound of it. "It also means no one could take you away. Not those missionaries who keep coming around, not the Indian agents, not anyone." James met her gaze directly. "This would be your home, legally recognized. Your land too, someday." Nitika was silent for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she asked, "Why would you do this?" It was the same question she'd asked that first night by the fire, and James found his answer had evolved. "Because you belong here now," he said simply. "With the ranch. With me." Later that evening, after Nitika had retired to her room, James sat alone by the fire, wondering if he'd made a mistake. Guardianship was one thing, but what he hadn't told her was that Judge Wilson had initially suggested adoption. The judge had quickly backtracked, explaining that legally adopting an Indian child would face significant obstacles and potential backlash from the community. "Guardianship is cleaner," Wilson had advised. "It gives her some protection without ruffling too many feathers." James had accepted this compromise, knowing it was better than nothing. Still, the conversation had forced him to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. Somewhere along the way, he had begun to think of Nitika as his daughter. His musings were interrupted by soft footsteps. Nitika appeared in the doorway, her long black hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual practical braid. "And I have been thinking about your offer," she said without preamble. James nodded, waiting. "My people believe that family is not just blood. It is also choice. Who you choose to stand beside when trouble comes." She took a deep breath. "I choose to stand beside you, James Cooper." A weight James hadn't realized he was carrying lifted from his chest. Then it settled. "We'll go to town tomorrow and sign the papers." Nitika nodded, but didn't leave. Instead, she said, "There is something you should know, something I have not told you." James tensed slightly. "What is it?" "The day you bought me, when those men were trying to sell me in town, they were not traders who found me after my tribe was killed." Her voice remained steady, but her hands clenched at her sides. "They were the ones who killed my family. They were scouts for the army. They burned our camp. And when they found me hiding, they decided to sell me instead of killing me. They thought it would be funny." James felt a cold fury rise in him, but kept his voice level. "Do you know their names?" The one called himself Captain Mills. The other one was Reed. James committed the names to memory. "Why tell me this now?" "Because if I am to be a Cooper, there should be no lies between us." She met his eyes unflinchingly. "And because someday, when I am older, I will find them." Any other guardian might have tried to dissuade her, to preach forgiveness or warn of the dangers of revenge. James did none of these things. He had seen enough of the world to know that some debts demanded payment. "When that day comes," he said quietly, "you won't go alone. 5 years passed, bringing changes both to the ranch and to its occupants. By 1878, James Cooper's property had expanded to include another 100 acres purchased from a neighbor who'd decided Montana winters weren't to his liking. The herd had grown as well, now numbering over 300 head of cattle that commanded top prices at market due to their quality. Nitika, now 19 years, had blossomed into a young woman of remarkable capability. Tall and straight-backed, with her dark hair still worn in a practical braid, she moved through the world with quiet confidence. In town, she was greeted with respect by merchants who had once regarded her with suspicion. Not because their prejudices had disappeared, but because she had proven herself too valuable to ignore. She negotiated cattle sales, arranged shipping contracts, and managed the ranch's finances with a shrewd intelligence that impressed even the most reluctant business partners. James, now in his mid-40s, found himself gradually stepping back, allowing Nitika to take more responsibility for the ranch's operations. His old war wound troubled him more in cold weather, and a fall from a horse 2 winters ago had left him with a persistent ache in his back. He still rode out with the cattle and worked alongside the 2 hands they'd hired, but more often now he found himself consulting with Nitika before making decisions. Their relationship had settled into a comfortable pattern, part father and daughter, part business partners. The guardianship had expired when Nitika turned 18, but nothing practical had changed between them. The ranch was their shared enterprise, their mutual legacy, or so James believed, until the letter arrived from back east. It came on a crisp October afternoon, delivered by a rider from the new telegraph office in town. James was repairing tack in the barn when Nitika brought it to him, her expression carefully neutral. "Special delivery," she said, handing him the envelope. "From Pennsylvania." James frowned, taking the letter with hands rough from work. He hadn't received correspondence from his home state in over a decade. Breaking the seal, he unfolded the paper and read in silence, his weathered face growing more troubled with each line. "What is it?" Nitika finally asked. James refolded the letter slowly. "My brother Robert has died. Typhoid." Nitika waited, knowing there was more. He had a son, William Boyes, 18 now, with no other family. James sighed heavily. "Robert's lawyer says the boy wants to come west, to live here." "Your nephew," Nitika said quietly. "Yes. Though I've never met him, Robert and we didn't part on good terms. He didn't approve of me coming west after Mary and Emily died. Thought I was running away." "Were you?" James gave her a wry look. "Probably, but I found something worth staying for, didn't I?" Nitika ignored the rare moment of sentimentality. "When will he arrive?" "Letter says he's already on his way. Should be here within the week." 3 days later, William Cooper arrived on the afternoon stage, a tall, lean young man with James's jawline and serious grey eyes. He carried a single trunk and the uncertain demeanor of someone who has traveled a great distance only to find himself in a world entirely unlike the one he left behind. As they approached the ranch, William noticed the figure waiting on the porch. "Is that your wife?" James felt a flicker of unease. He had mentioned Nitika in his reply to the lawyer, explaining that she was his former ward, who now helped run the ranch. But he realized that his brief description might have been misinterpreted. "That's Nitika," he said simply. He paused, searching for the right words. "She's my partner in the ranch. Has been for years now." William's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing more as they pulled up to the house. Nitika stepped forward as they disembarked, her expression carefully composed. She'd dressed in her town clothes, a dark skirt and white blouse, with a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "William, this is Nitika Cooper," James said. "Nitika, my nephew William." "Cooper?" William asked, confusion evident in his voice as he took in Nitika's distinctly native features. "Yes," Nitika said. her voice cool but polite. "You James became my guardian when I was 12. I kept the name after I came of age." William nodded slowly, visibly recalibrating his understanding of the situation. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Cooper." Montana Territory, 1893. The ranch house had grown over the years, expanding to accommodate the changing needs of its inhabitants. A new wing had been added to the east side, with large windows that caught the morning sun. The original structure had been modernized with proper plumbing and a telephone line that connected them to the rapidly growing town of White Ridge, now boasting nearly 2,000 residents. James Cooper, now approaching 60, sat in a rocking chair on the wide front porch, watching the activity in the yard below. His hair had gone completely white, and the old war wound in his leg had stiffened to the point that he walked with a pronounced limp, using a carved hickory cane Nitika had given him for his 55th birthday. Yet his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing as he surveyed his domain. Cooper Ranch had prospered beyond even his most ambitious dreams. What had begun as 200 acres now encompassed nearly 2,000, with 800 head of cattle, 40 horses, and 15 full-time ranch hands. Their breeding stock was renowned throughout the territory, fetching premium prices at auction. But it wasn't the buildings or the cattle that gave James the most satisfaction as he rocked gently in the autumn sunshine. It was the people. In the corral beyond the barn, William, now 33 and fully into his prime, was working with a spirited 2-year-old colt, his movements confident and patient as he guided the animal through its paces. William had married 4 years earlier, a school teacher named Sarah, who had come west from Boston seeking adventure and had found both that and love on Cooper Ranch. Their 3-year-old son, James Robert Cooper, named for both his great-uncle and grandfather, toddled around the edge of the corral, closely supervised by his mother, who was visibly expecting their second child. And then there was Nitika. At 34, she remained the heart of the ranch's operations. Though she had officially ceded the title of ranch manager to William 2 years ago, everyone knew that no major decision was made without her input. She had grown into a woman of quiet authority, respected throughout the territory, not just as Cooper's Indian girl, but as a businesswoman and rancher in her own right. That evening, after supper, James called William into his study while Sarah put little James Robert to bed. Nitika joined them, sitting quietly in the corner as James explained his plan for a trust that would ensure Nitika's position would be protected even under new state laws. William listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When James finished, he glanced at Nitika, then back to his uncle. "I think it's a wise precaution," he said simply. "Nitika built this ranch alongside you long before I arrived. Her place here should be secure, regardless of what new state laws might bring." As they rose to leave, William paused at the door. "Uncle James, there's something Sarah and I have been meaning to discuss with you both. We've been thinking about the new baby." "What about it?" James asked. "If it's a girl," William said, his gaze including both James and Nitika, "we'd like to name her Nitika, to honor what you've both built here, and the legacy that will continue through our children." Nitika, usually so composed, looked momentarily stunned. That is a great honor," she said finally, her voice uncharacteristically soft. 3 months later, on a clear winter morning, Nitika Mary Cooper was born in the east bedroom of the ranch house, her first cries announcing her arrival to a family structure unlike any other in Montana Territory. James, standing in the hallway with William when Sarah's exhausted but triumphant voice called them in, felt a sense of completion as he gazed down at the infant, her wispy dark hair and fair skin a physical representation of the blended family they had created. As snow began to fall outside, casting the ranch in a peaceful white blanket, James found Nitika standing alone on the porch, watching the flakes drift down. "Do you ever think about that day?" James asked finally. "When I bought you for $5? Nitika's expression grew contemplative. Sometimes it seems like another life, another person. I was just thinking that it might have been the only truly wise investment I ever made, James said, a rare hint of humor in his voice. Nitika laughed softly. $5 for half a ranch? Yes, I would say that was a good investment. But they both knew it had yielded far more than land or cattle. It had created a family where none had existed, forged bonds that transcended blood and background, and established a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. In the years to come, Cooper Ranch would continue to prosper under William's management, with Nitika remaining a guiding presence until her death at the age of 76 in 1935. The little girl named for her would grow up to become one of Montana's first female physicians, establishing a clinic that served both settlers and native communities with equal dedication. And on a small hill overlooking the ranch, 3 headstones would eventually stand side by side: James Cooper, William Cooper, and Nitika Cooper, whose simple marker bore only her name, her dates, and a single line that captured the unlikely journey of an Apache girl bought for $5, who carried forward a legacy. She found her way home,